It gives me great pleasure to be with you today for the second day of this AfriSummit. That is really a great opportunity to connect and collaborate among the different MedTech stakeholders. Today I'm going to be starting the first session of the day. For those of you who might not know me, I'm Rana Chalhoub, Regulatory Affairs Director at Mecomed. And for today's session, I'm going to give you a different perspective for regulatory affairs that I myself got to experience via a project called MDRC, Medical Device Regulatory Convergence with USAID. In today's presentation, we're going to see how good regulatory practice and their implementation into the technical regulations can be an actual enabler for market access. So for the agenda for today, I'm going to set the scene by giving the relationship and the context between health, trade, and transparency. Good regulatory practice, we're going to delve into the main principles for GRP, the WTO technical barriers to trade, or what we call the TBT agreement, and with some key overarching takeaways. So when we talk, to put things into context and see how regulatory relates to trade, we're going to start with health that we are familiar with. When we talk about health, we talk eventually about the WHO guidance documents, whether the famous reliance and recognition guidance, the stepwise approach to regulate medical technology, starting with basic level of controls, moving forward to expanded level of controls, and by risk class, and then public health system prioritization and health equity, and eventually IMDRF guidance documents that are a great resource for any medtech regulator. Moving to trade. So for trade, here we're gonna go in different direction. We're gonna talk about the WTO, which is the World Trade Organization requirement. It's a treaty obligation, and it mandates the use of international standards for all member states. The main purpose is to prevent barriers to trade, whether we're talking about the regular that we know, the tariff barriers to trade, but more importantly, the non-tariff barriers to trade that can take different formats. And finally, an important key to relate these two together is transparency. So transparency to make sure all stakeholders are engaged, are informed, and have a predictable regulation where everyone can comply. So what's GRP? So good regulatory practice, or GRP, if we go into the definition, it's really it's a formalized, mandatory, whole of government policy. So here we're not talking about medtech only. It's all the regulated industry that defines the rules by which the regulatory agencies develop technical regulations for all these regulated sectors. So it's the control mechanism. So if you want to look at it from the manufacturers that have in place the ISO 13485 as a quality system that mandates how the medical devices are manufactured, GRP is the same. It's the quality control mechanism for the development of the regulations. So to ensure these regulations are always of highest quality, they are cost-effective, internationally aligned, and least economically restrictive among different other alternatives. So in this slide, I want really to show you how GRP is really the foundational, the transversal and cross-sectoral rulemaking process across not only medical devices, as you can see, even pharmaceuticals, chemicals, even other industries like construction, toys. So GRP is really involved and embedded in the rulemaking process across all different regulatory agencies of the different industries. So when we talk GRP, there are three things to remember. We're not talking about more regulation. We're not talking about less regulation, but we're talking about better regulatory outcomes. So an efficient regulator. This is what we need to keep in mind, a balanced regulation. GRP, it's an internal coordination process that the government use to make sure all the regulations they publish and they develop, they are crafted in an open, transparent, and participatory manner, so giving opportunity for all stakeholders to comment on this regulation, and that the outcomes are risk-based and grounded to the best available data. So it's very important to always have sound science-based regulation and have a risk-based implementation. GRP is very important for international cooperation because, as you have seen, we are in a global world, and no government can work in silo. So what are the chances really of a government working alone to identify a problem or even a solution to a problem that hasn't been already identified by another government? So regulatory cooperation is key, and only quality regulatory outcomes will avail a perfect regulatory cooperation. We have talked about several words that I wanted to highlight here that are usually used interchangeably, but there are a little bit of difference between these three words. So when we talk about cooperation, what is a regulatory cooperation? So it's the basic form of interaction between the different countries that results in some form of cooperation in order to increase the efficiency of the regulatory framework. So it's initially the first step of any interaction between governments. If we want to move one step up, so we go to regulatory convergence in this case. So regulatory convergence, it still remains a form of cooperation, but when the countries decide to modify their existing or even their proposed regulation to bring them into closer alignment with other governments. So this alignment is a bit challenging because the timing of the regulation is different between the different governments. And finally, the ultimate form of cooperation that we have talked a lot yesterday about is reliance. So reliance, it's really the ultimate form of cooperation because here it's one authority, they decide to give significant weight to the assessment that are performed by another trusted regulatory authority in order to reach their own decision. Very important point that the relying authority will always remain independent, will always be responsible, accountable for the own decision making, even though it relies on the decision or assessment made by other authorities. So good regulatory practice has 13 elements that we need to keep in mind. I'm going to go quickly through these, let's say, components of GRP, but it's very important to have these in mind. So when we implement good regulatory practice, we need to issue a regulatory forecast. So it's important for the different stakeholders to have a visibility of what's coming as regulation, to have proper planning in mind. So to have, let's say, an idea of the upcoming draft regulation. Have a national regular register that encompasses the existing regulation and guidances, provide opportunity for public comment. This point is really important, and the WTO-TBT agreement recommends 60 days minimum period to provide opportunity for any new published regulation to collect the stakeholders' feedback. Publish evidence and conduct regulatory analysis. It's important to have really a science-based regulation, to have a regulatory analysis of the cost, of the benefit, of the impact of the regulation that we're going to publish. Respond to stakeholder input, whether the feedback has been taken into consideration or not, what's the proposed alternative. Use quality data and sound science. It's very important to have, again, a science-based regulation based on facts, on data. Employ risk-based approach. This is very common for medtech. We know the different risk classes for medical devices, whether class 1 up to class 3. So have a transition, let's say staggered implementation as per risk class. Conduct regulatory impact assessment. This is very important as well to see, as I mentioned, the impact of this regulation, not only after the regulation is published, but also before developing the regulation to keep this in mind. Conduct pro-competitive analysis. You have always to have a level playing field for the different players that will be impacted by this regulation. Assess the international impact of regulation, because no one is working in silos, so every government is looking to even export their goods. So they need to keep this in mind that this regulation is going to impact their relationship with other countries. And we have seen this with the impact of the EU MDR, how it has impacted the different international markets using this certification. Assess, use international standards as basis of a national regulation. Whenever there is an international standard, it's always recommended to adapt and adopt this international standards and avoid as much as possible country-specific local standards. Conduct ex post assessment of regulatory impact. As we talk, we need to assess the regulation before, but also after, especially in medtech, because it's a fast-moving environment. So we might need to update this regulation. Maybe the regulation is not relevant anymore. We need to have a new regulation. Establish a central regulatory coordination body that has the power to oversee and overlook among the different regulatory agencies. So as we have seen, these elements, they span throughout all the regulatory life cycle, from initially identifying the need, why are we putting this regulation, what do we want to achieve? So we need to have clear objectives, always keeping in mind a least trade restrictive approach, gather the data and stakeholder input, then design the regulation, put it for public comments, collecting feedback, implement regulation, provide proper transition time for implementation, and then assess the regulatory impact and see whether any changes need to be done. So we always need to close the loop and ensure the continuous cycle. So the implementation of GRP, it's a significant step for regulatory cooperation, and that keeps in mind always less cross-border rights. So when we talk about good regulatory practice, it's a great tool in the hand of all the regulatory governments, and three main elements have been taken further and incorporated into actual trade agreements between the countries. The regulatory impact assessment, stakeholder engagement, and the post-evaluation. And over the last years, we have seen really a high increase in the cost of goods, but also in the time to market that is due to regulatory divergence. So diverging regulations really could constitute a non-tariff barriers to trade. As I mentioned, this has been taken and incorporated into trade agreement. The first one was the 2012 OECD, which is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, that has adopted these three elements for regulatory assessment, stakeholder engagement, and post-evaluation to be part of the trade agreement and to be binding by the countries who have signed and agreed to apply this trade agreement. Another example of trade agreement having GRP as part of it is the USMCA, or US-Mexico-Canada agreement, that also has three elements that are part of this, a full chapter on GRP, and the purpose always to minimize the trade costs that are due of regulatory diversions. So moving from GRP to trade, the ultimate form of GRP is eventually the WTO Technical Barriers to Trade, or TBT agreement. To those of you who are not familiar with the WTO, it's the only international body that deals with the rules of trade. It has on board 164 member states who have decided to sign and have this as a treaty obligation for any movement of goods between respective countries. So really, it provides a legal ground for international commerce and flow of goods. They bind the governments to keep their trade policies within agreed trade limits, always keeping in mind least trade restrictive manner. And it helps trade flow as freely as possible by having a purpose to remove any barriers to trade and providing confidence, transparency, and predictability. In this slide, this is what we have seen over the past year. The tariff barrier to trade is the tariff like the custom duties that we are usually familiar to, that are well defined, and that we well know when we import or export within the countries. What we have seen in the last few years is an increase of what we call NTB, or non-tariff barriers to trade. So what's an NTB? An NTB can take different formats. It can be a technical regulation, an environmental regulation, transport regulation. It could be a standard, a local labeling requirements. All these could be identified as non-tariff barriers to trade and could be in disguise. So they are not really always clear of what these barriers are, and it constitutes a hinder for the free movement of goods. So what's the purpose of the TBT agreement? It's really an important tool and instrument, as it helps to, first, encourage members to use less trade restrictive approach to meet regulatory objectives. So always have a regulation that have positive and efficient regulatory outcomes and that does not be hindering to trade. Harmonize through the use of international relevant standards whenever there is international standards adopted. Provide transparency to provide as well engagement for the different stakeholders and have a visibility of what's going on. And finally, avoid and resolve trade disputes related to standard matters. What does it safeguard against? So the use of technical requirements, or what we talked as non-tariff barrier to trade, as disguised restriction on trade, and the development of inefficient technical requirements and procedure. So really by being, let's say, by abiding to the technical barrier to trade agreement, you ensure that you are promoting the good use of standards and you are developing efficient regulations and avoiding as much as possible non-tariff barriers to trade. What are the main principles of the TBT agreement? So again, avoidance of unnecessary barriers to trade. Transparency. For the transparency, they have developed a very important tool that we're going to go through in the next slide, which is called e-ping, that provide visibility of what are the trade notifications happening and new regulation happening. Concept of equivalence, mutual recognition of conformity assessment procedure, again, applying to cooperation all the way through reliance. Harmonization starts by using international standards and adopting them, implementing them into the technical regulations. And finally, non-discrimination and have a fair level playing field. We have used different terminology as part of the TBT agreement that I would like to shed a light on the definition. Technical regulation. When we talk technical regulation, it's true, it's a document that provides what are the product characteristics and the process for production methods. But the most important part is that when we talk about technical regulation, compliance is mandatory. However, when we talk about standard, which is a document that is approved, drafted by a recognized body, usually the SDOs or standard development organizations are the ones who develop standards, ISO, IEC, that we are familiar with. So the standard, the compliance is not mandatory to standard. And finally, conformity assessment, it is the procedure that is being used to validate that the relevant requirements that are laid, whether in the technical regulation or in the standard, have been met. And there are different methods for conformity assessment, whether sampling, inspection, evaluation, verification of conformity, accreditation, and others. So how do we make standard to which compliance is not mandatory being mandatory as a technical regulation? It is all in the Article 2.4 of the TBT agreement that states clearly that where technical regulations are required, relevant international standards exist, members shall use these standards as a basis for the technical regulation. So when you incorporate the standard into the technical regulation, compliance will become mandatory. Another article, very important, it's that members shall always ensure that technical regulations are not prepared in the purpose of creating unnecessary obstacles to trade, and always keep a less trade restrictive manner. Very important point, 2.3, that the regulations need to be reviewed, and the initial, let's say, conditions that created these regulations might not be after a certain period of time that they don't exist, or they might be a less restrictive manner to put the regulation to meet the same objective. So it's always important to revise this regulation and look into a better way and more efficient regulatory outcomes. What I mentioned, I would like to just a few slides on the e-ping system that I mentioned. The e-ping system, it's really a very important tool that has been made available by the WTO. It's publicly available and it's free of charge, so everyone or anyone can subscribe and have an account on e-ping. And it helps you receive all trade alerts or notifications happening in the market. You can also clarify what market you want to receive the notification, because again, when we talk trade, we talk about all industries, so we can specify, for example, for which countries we want to receive the alerts, for which sectors we want to receive the alert or industry. And always you can as well search notification, upload additional information, you can participate in the discussion. It's really a great platform to ensure the transparency, as is always provide an inquiry point, that is the person who has issued the trade alert. So you may reach out to them if you want to have more information on this particular regulation, or even you want to have, let's say you want to provide comments, so you always have the right person that is included there. This is I have included the link in the presentation for the e-ping system, and this is the main page. And again, this one that shows that you can filter by country, you can filter by industry, and also you have the proper contact person with whom you may reach out to and engage in order to have more information or in order to submit your comments. It's important to note that if a new, let's say, regulation or a new change is not submitted into WTO EPING system, it will be considered as a breach to the TBT agreement. So what are our takeaways for today? Again, GRP, we're not talking about more or less regulation. We're talking about efficient regulation, better regulatory outcomes. GRP is the quality assurance system for a government's regulatory process to make sure their developed regulations are of highest quality, of highest efficiency, and of highest standards. The WTO TBT agreement is a form of good regulatory practice, and it's legally binding, as it is an international treaty obligation. If we talk about MedTech, the WHO always encourages medical device regulations to use international standards as part of reliance and recognition. However, the WTO requires medical device regulators to use international standards. So it's important to highlight this difference. And finally, using these international standards could be the pathway to harmonize cross-border requirement and have really a free flow of movement of goods between the respective countries. So what could medical technology benefit from? It's important always to look into implementing the TBT agreement as a good regulatory practice within the medical device regulation. So it's important to have more and more awareness for all medical device regulators on the existing of this agreement and that their government have decided to abide with this agreement. So they need to match their strategy and internal policy accordingly. More awareness on the IMDRF guidance documents when it comes to MedTech and relevant standards that are applicable, whether ISO, IEC, and others. Resource optimization, avoid the use of duplicating the resource and dedicating these limited resources that we are all, the scarcity of resources that is the main challenge, into developing really, into looking into market surveillance and avoid developing country agency unique requirements. Here I'd like really to share an example from US FDA CDRH department that have mentioned that with 2,000 people on board of the CDRH, they have stated clearly that they don't have enough resources or bandwidths to create US-specific standards or US-specific requirements, and they're looking into aligning with the international. So awareness of the TBT agreement, not only after the regulation is published, but before the regulation is published, always keeping in mind the different elements or components of this agreement when drafting the regulation. And again, medical devices to be regulated properly as medical technology in differentiation to drug. Another example here as well, we are seeing more and more that medical technology is getting 85% closer to ICT, which is information communication technology, and 15% close to pharma. So it's really important to have proper documentation, proper regulation, looking at MedTech as MedTech. So I would like to end with a final quote. If you think compliance with regulation is expensive, try non-compliance. And I believe you would definitely find out that the cost of non-compliance is even much higher. So here I have as well included a couple of references of the different WHO, WTO, IMDRF, from which I got some of the materials for this presentation, and like as well that the materials is courtesy of the MDRC project. And this is my contact details if you would like to reach out. And hopefully this was an eye-opener and an interesting perspective for regulatory affairs at the start of the second day.
Hello? Okay. Yeah. Rana, I think your presentation is very insightful and very important. And I guess that the conclusion says it all, is compliance and try non-compliance. And I guess as companies, speaking about companies, we all want to be compliant to the rules and the regulations. But at the same time, as you mentioned, sometimes those rules and regulations are constituting a big burden on companies, and they are not able to perhaps meet all those regulations, and it becomes a stop for the access, because we all think ultimately why we are all here, because we're thinking to get good products, safe products to our patients. So that would become as well a big hindering to getting those products into the patient, and it's important that we take whatever you have said very seriously. From a company perspective, from companies, and from regulator perspective, in order to reach the harmony we are all looking for for the ultimate benefit of the patients. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carol, for the comment. I couldn't agree more. So at the end of the day, we're sharing the same objective, which is the access of safe and effective technology. So if we have the safe and effective technology not reaching on time to the patient, so we're losing the whole point. So it's important to have the proper balance. Yeah. Thank you. So I would like to present my next speaker. I would like to give it to Avanti Govender Baster, who is the Vice Chair of Summit and also the Associate Regulatory Affairs and Quality Manager of Alcon. Over to you, Avanti, for the next session. Thank you.